Hi, good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I wanted to start by thanking Valerie and all of her colleagues at the Historic Artist Homes and Studios for the invitation to participate in this conference. It's my first time attending, but I have admired from afar the work that HAHS has done over the years, and I'm especially excited to share with all of you my research on the home studio of Thomas Moran and Mary Nimmo Moran, especially on the heels of the site's election to HAHS earlier this spring. So I first visited the Moran's home studio in East Hampton, Long Island in 2010, when I was beginning research on the life and works of Mary Nimmo Moran, who would subsequently become the subject of my doctoral dissertation. At the time, the home studio looked a lot more like this. And I've had the great privilege of watching the incredible transformation of this site over the past 9 years, as it was saved from near collapse in 2012, now restored to its former glory, and is soon scheduled to reopen to the public for this summer season. And I say reopen because the Moran's home studio was a place that attracted attention and drew visitors from nearly the moment that the couple laid the cornerstone at 10:30 in the morning, September 30th, 1884. And this moment was memorialized in the document that you see here. Signed by friends, family members, and neighbors, it was placed inside one of the studio's foundation piers, where it remained until it was unearthed by a mason working on the studio's restoration in 2013. And this is just one of the many incredible discoveries that have taken place at the site during its restoration. Now, a year after the Morans laid the cornerstone, the Century magazine published an article on the summer haunts of American artists, which was accompanied by this interior view of the Morans' recently completed East Hampton home and studio. A period photograph reveals the accuracy with which Thomas Moran, who etched the plate for the illustration, depicted the studio's layout and contents, from an in-progress landscape painting on an easel at left, to the textiles, ornately carved furnishings, and salon-style hang of artworks in the loft. And this is perhaps the greatest antithesis to that restrained modernist aesthetic that we saw in Georgia O'Keeffe's studio yesterday. Now, providing a glimpse into the privileged space of artistic creation, the illustration identified the studio as belonging to Thomas Moran. In actuality, however, it was a space of creation for both Moran and his wife, Mary Nimmo, who together sketched, etched, and painted the landscape of East Hampton and beyond while residing in the town for nearly 2 decades. For those unfamiliar with their story, Thomas Moran, an English immigrant, met Mary Nimmo, a Scottish immigrant, while the two were living in Philadelphia in 1858. They were married 5 years later and together pursued professional careers in the arts. Thomas Moran, who was an essentially self-taught artist himself, trained his wife in the art of landscape painting, and soon thereafter they traveled the world together to study art and nature, from the grand galleries of London and Paris to the sequoia groves of Yosemite. Throughout their careers, the couple always shared studio space, including in Newark, New Jersey, where they moved in 1872, and later in New York City, where they always maintained a winter studio. The same was then true when they decided to establish a shared summer residence in East Hampton, the picturesque town located on Long Island's southern shore. They were first encouraged to visit East Hampton at the suggestion of close friend William McKay Laffin, a journalist, painter, and member of the bohemian art collective known as the Tile Club. In 1878, Laffin arranged for club members to participate in a sketching trip across the 120-mile stretch of land from Brooklyn to Montauk Point. The trip resulted in an article published in the popular Scribner's Monthly magazine, where it was illustrated with sketches executed during the club's journey, such as Edwin Austin Abbey's sketching at East Hampton, which you see here. Of all the sites visited, the Tile Club described East Hampton as the most attractive, struck as they were by its seemingly untouched character, reporting to readers that, quote, our tourists came out upon a scene of freshness and uncontaminated splendor, such as they had no idea existed just 100 miles from New York City. Although the Tile Club is often credited with discovering East Hampton as an artistic destination in 1878, Long Island's East End inspired artists and writers dating back to the 18th century, and it was already a popular spot with tourists and landscape painters even as early as the 1870s, when artists such as Winslow Homer and John Ferguson Weir captured scenes of oceanfront recreation, featuring the multitude of overheated urbanites who populated the town in the summer months. With the extension of the Long Island Railroad in the late 1870s, East Hampton's popularity continued to grow with urban artists, and in 1883, Lippincott's magazine declared the town to be the American Barbizon, overrun as it was by artists working on plein air. As one critic noted in the early 1880s, quote, "Art became the fashion for the entire summer colony. Farmers of East Hampton could hardly get out to their own barnyards to milk the cows, for the easels and mushroom-like umbrellas were so thick." Although the Morans' first excursion to the East End in 1878 lasted only a few weeks, by 1880 they were spending up to 6 months of each year in East Hampton, painting and etching the local landscape, which served as a major source of inspiration for both artists throughout the remainder of their careers. The couple was drawn to the area's diverse topography, which offered, as one critic wrote, quote, "rural nooks for the landscape painter, beach and sea panoramas, stormy cloud battles, shimmering calm, sea salt breezes, and sunshine for all." After renting summer dwellings in East Hampton for 4 years, as was common practice among visitors to the town, the couple finally decided to establish a permanent studio and residence. In November of 1883, they purchased a plot of land measuring 2/3 of an acre on East Hampton's Main Street. The deed, which is signed by Mary Nimmo Moran, indicates that the couple paid $1,500 for the property. The structure that they would soon build on the land was the first purpose-built artist home and studio in the town, and their presence gave the growing art colony a greater sense of permanence and continuity. If the Morans drew up plans for the studio, they are not known to have survived, and we therefore have to rely on historic photographs of the interior and the exterior, as well as the restoration plans, which were drafted by the historic preservationist Robert Hefner, who has done an enormous amount of research on the construction of the home studio and to whose work I am greatly indebted. While the Morans expanded the house over the course of several decades, the earliest and most substantial section, the heart, so to speak, of the home studio, was built in 1884, and it is here outlined in red. Of course, expectedly, the largest room was the studio, occupying more than 2/3 of the ground floor and expanding upwards to the second story. Moran, who was not trained as an architect, worked closely with local East Hampton builder Stafford Tillinghast when planning the construction. As Hefner has demonstrated, Tillinghast built a simple barn-like structure to which Moran added distinctive and often whimsical architectural details which give the home its individualistic character. Now, many of these architectural elements were in fact repurposed from buildings in New York City. For instance, the large, nearly floor-to-ceiling window, which floods the studio interior with an abundance of natural light, was salvaged by Moran from a demolished candy shop at 938 Broadway in Lower Manhattan. Moran actually installed the window upside down with the transom at the bottom, creatively manipulating it to better suit his studio's needs. Moreover, the front doors came from this same candy shop and were also lifted by Thomas Moran and shipped off to East Hampton, where they were then installed in the studio and have recently been restored and look absolutely gorgeous. Although repurposing materials was not an uncommon building practice in the 1880s, I believe that this approach also reflects the entrepreneurial spirit that Thomas Moran exhibited throughout his career. He approached the construction creatively, seeking out inventive and resourceful solutions, leading one historian to aptly compare the home studio to a large piece of assemblage sculpture, one that is composed of a wide array of accumulated parts to create an expressive whole. And when I was listening to Wanda's talk last night, it occurred to me that this is precisely the process that Moran also used when composing his large-scale landscape compositions as well. Now, the studio interior featured a staircase, which leads to the second-story loft and then up to the third floor. The posts, handrails, and balusters were all salvaged from Greek Revival-style residences in New York City and were artfully combined by Moran, as you can see in the detail on the left. Below, he incorporated 2 Ionic columns, which were repurposed from a residential entryway, and here functioned not only as supports, but also worked to separate the space of the studio from that of the dining room, which was located during their lifetime beneath the loft. And this is a recreation, modern day, that you see here on the left. When the Morans lived in the home, they further separated these spaces intentionally, one professional, the other domestic, with elaborate textile hangings. And this division between working space and personal space was also reinforced with the placement of all 4 bedrooms up and out of view on the 3rd floor. When compared to the space of the studio, the living quarters are considerably more modest. And in 1885, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle comically commented on this arrangement, writing, quote, "Mr. Moran is about to take his summer quarters in East Hampton, where he has built himself a cottage with a studio annex, or rather a studio with a cottage annex, for the studio is 30 by 40 feet in dimension." I think a clear indication of the couple's priorities. While the 1st floor of the studio was used as a workspace, complete with easels and painter's palettes, the 2nd floor loft functioned as a gallery for the display of small-scale works on paper. Hanging on the far wall are identifiable examples of etchings by Mary Nimmo Moran, including one example seen here. Although Nimmo Moran etched her plates en plein air or out of doors, she experimented extensively with inking and printing on her own etching press. However, given the weight of a press and the chemicals necessary for etching a plate, namely acid, Nimmo Moran most likely did not print inside the main studio space, but instead may have created a kind of ad hoc printing studio, which perhaps she placed in the prefabricated building, located then, as it is now, in the backyard of the house. Now, in addition to creating artworks in the studio and displaying them throughout, the Morans also collected a wide array of objects during their travels. These were then artfully installed throughout the studio space, and an inventory compiled at the time of Thomas Moran's death provides a sense of the eclecticism of their collection, which included a mahogany side chair, a Japanese bronze incense burner, piece of petrified wood, a Chinese covered bowl, a bronze gong, an Italian carved wood and polychrome statue of the Virgin, an Indian chest, a Kazakh rug, a Persian runner, 17 assorted Navajo scatter rugs, and this list goes on and on and on, but I think you get the idea. Now, the couple went to great lengths to carefully curate the interior decor, creating a fully integrated artistic space, one that conveyed their fashionability, sophistication, and worldliness to visitors who included not only their friends and family, but also art critics, collectors, and New York City-based artists and writers, many of whom the Morans hosted for salon-style gatherings, costume balls, musical performances, and Shakespearean readings in the space of the studio. Now, since the couple typically resided in East Hampton from about April to November of each year, they spent much of their time out of doors, and the exterior gardens played an equally important role in the overall artful atmosphere of the home studio. Much of the landscaping around the property was designed by Mary Nimmo Moran, who was an avid gardener and was said to have an intimate knowledge of trees and flowers from her practical work among them. She was photographed on numerous occasions in her garden, standing among the chrysanthemums, which also inspired a series of landscape paintings by the artist in the 1890s. In this work, she depicted the sun-speckled walkway lining the south side of the studio, framing the scene on the left with the Queen Anne-style sash window of the studio's turret. Over the years, the studio and its grounds inspired several works by both the Morans and their contemporaries, including, just as one example, a work by the California-based artist Theodore Wars, who painted this work on the right following a visit to the couple's home in 1898. Now, as previously mentioned, the Morans continued to build onto the studio over time, and to the back of the home they added a kitchen, a laundry, bathrooms, and maid quarters. These expansions evolved organically, perhaps even somewhat haphazardly, to accumulate their growing needs and ultimately contribute to the sort of quirky, asymmetrical character of the building that we see today. Now, unfortunately, in 1899, 15 years after they laid the cornerstone for the studio, Mary Nimmo Moran, who was just 58 years old at the time, died very unexpectedly from typhoid fever. Her death absolutely devastated Thomas Moran, who shortly after her passing moved into a boarding house at 84 Irving Place in New York City. Although he always maintained ownership of the home studio in East Hampton, he spent much of the next 2.5 decades traveling in both North and South America and in Europe. Later in life, he would settle in Santa Barbara, California, where he eventually died in 1926. The property then passed into the possession of the couple's daughter, Ruth Moran, who maintained it until her death in 1948, when it was purchased by a local family. Now, despite the fact that the building was dedicated a National Historic Landmark in 1966, it fell into disrepair and nearly collapsed during Hurricane Sandy in 2012, when it sunk about 2 feet into the ground. And the photo that you see here is taken shortly after the hurricane. Since then, the restoration efforts have been astonishing, and the investment of resources into renovating and researching the site provides a unique opportunity to not only reevaluate the lives and works of the two artists who built and lived in this space, but to also reassess their legacy in the area, notably the impact their studio had on the development of Eastern Long Island as an artist retreat, attracting the likes of William Merritt Chase and Childe Hassam in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, later drawing artists such as Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner, and Elaine and William de Kooning to its shores, and more recently, enticing contemporary artists such as David Salle and Cindy Sherman. And my final slide is a comparison I couldn't resist. Now, as the home studio of Thomas Moran and Mary Nimmo Moran embarks upon its next chapter, I look forward to seeing how its history as a shared space of artistic creation helps to shape its future. Thank you.